Hello and welcome to the discussion. This channel is here to serve as a platform for scholarly discussions about some of the most significant questions regarding the history of early Christianity, the philosophy of religion, and systematic theology. My name is Nahoa Life, and I'm here to ask those questions, to seek truth openly and critically, and to share the journey with you. This first season is centered around the history of early Christianity, and especially the question of Jesus' resurrection. In this video, we'll discuss what I think is the most plausible alternative to the resurrection. The scholar joining and teaching us today earned his master's and doctorate's degree from Duke University and is Richard J. Dearborn Professor of New Testament at Princeton Theological Seminary. He's written extensively on a number of topics, but his 2021 book, The Resurrection of Jesus, Apologetics, Polemics, and History, has been especially influential to me. This, being the most fair and thorough treatment of the subject I've read so far, has truly challenged and inspired me to pursue deeper understanding. So I'm honored to have a discussion with this eminent scholar. So, Dr. Dale Allison, how are you?
I'm great. Happy to be here. Looking forward to the conversation.
Yeah, me too. So I have some preliminary questions I want to ask you, and we can start. We can just jump in if that's all right.
Sure, go ahead.
So first, I want to ask, how do you, as a scholar, approach the question of Jesus' resurrection? And more specifically, you talk about in your book different personalities, like a pious Christian, a hard-hearted historian, a sort of hyper-skeptic, and a Fortean who acknowledges anomalies. So how do these different selves interact with one another when you approach Christian origins?
Well, I don't know how they interact except that they dialogue with each other and they seem to like and enjoy each other. They have friendly disagreements and friendly conversations, and at the end of the day, they still like each other despite their disagreements. So you're referring to the beginning of the book, and in the very beginning, I say I have four personalities or sub personalities within me, that I'm a sort of multiple personality, and one part up front is just a what I call a pious Christian. I go to church, I say my prayers, I try to think theologically, and for that individual, the resurrection of Jesus is what it is in the book of Acts. It's the sort of undoing of, or the answer to, the crucifixion. You crucified Jesus, but God has raised him from the dead. So it's the justification for the continuing of the story of Jesus, and it's a vindication of what he was all about. More personally, I suppose I could talk about my own personal Jesus. When you say Jesus, that can be parsed in any number of ways. For me, I suppose primarily Jesus is the Jesus of the Sermon on the Mount, the Jesus of certain parts of Luke, especially the parables, and the Jesus, the suffering and mostly quiet Jesus of the Mark and Passion narrative. And I like that person, am keenly attracted to that person, and want that person's cause to be vindicated. But beside that, pious Christian is what I like to think of as a critical historian. A lot of people don't think I'm critical enough, but I think it's really tough to say too many things with great confidence or assurance about the earliest traditions of the resurrection. One of the things that bothers some of my more conservative friends or my apologetical friends is that I don't know what to do at all with Paul's reference in 1 Corinthians 15 to an appearance to the 500. It's just pretty much a bare statement, and some are still alive, and it happened all at once. But I personally don't know how to spin much out of that. And I also think it's really hard to think that you can get back, for example, into the experience Paul had on the Damascus Road. We have these very short accounts in Acts, which aren't from Paul himself, at least directly, and then a few references in Paul's epistles, but he never gives a lot of data on what happened to him. There's no paragraph where he says, okay, everybody, this is exactly what happened to me. So things like this make me really, really cautious. And I'm always recalling a statement of Origen, who's one of my heroes, who said that one of the hardest things to do is to show that something happened, even if it did happen. Just because something happened doesn't guarantee that we can show that it happened or that all the evidence is going to be demonstrably for it. So this second person, this critical historian, is not as enthusiastic as some people are as to how much data we can get. And this person also goes back and forth on certain questions, like the empty tomb. So in the book, I argue that the tomb was probably empty, but I don't think this is a slam dunk case. And I think the evidence is on, there's evidence on both sides, or there are reasons for thinking yes and no. So that's why this is so hard, and why I want to be a critical historian. I also don't want to be simply a victim of confirmation bias. So I think that's what most of us are doing most of the time. We already know or suspect what we're going to conclude, and then we come there and we convince ourselves that the arguments are what led us to it, but we really started out with the conclusion. So this person wants to be a critical historian, knowing how easily we conjure arguments to comfort and reassure ourselves. The third person is a sort of Socratic figure who knows that he knows nothing, and it's really the case that metaphysically, I don't understand God. Metaphysically, I don't know who I am. I don't really know what consciousness is. I don't know what photons are. I have no comprehension of this gigantic universe or multiverse, whatever it is. So I think I'm very small, and I think I have a very small mind. So this third person is a sort of I don't know. I don't know person. But the fourth one, for various reasons, is what I call a Fordian. And this person thinks the world is just really strange. It's much stranger than most people think it is. This person thinks clairvoyance is common and telepathy is common, and lots of other stranger things are fairly common. And this person just looks at the resurrection and says, well, why not? I mean, why not? The world's an awfully weird, strange place. What's another weird, strange thing in it? So these four people, or personalities, subpersonalities, are always talking and going back and forth. And I don't really know what the dominant personality is, or if I'm somehow a fifth person listening to them discuss these things. Again, I'm a mystery to myself, but maybe that gives you a sense for for the complexity that's going on inside.
Yeah, I mean, do you kind of deal with like a sort of cognitive dissonance? Does it feel like cognitive dissonance, like the pious Christian is kind of committed to, the resurrection and Christianity, while the hyper skeptic is, doesn't know anything, is, you know?
Yeah, of course. So, yeah, these people are not the same person, so they disagree with each other, and they each give the other pause for thought. So, yeah, the pious Christian would like everything to be obvious and clear, and would like to be able to say A with confidence and B with confidence, but is sort of humbled and made more modest, maybe by the other personalities that are out there. So I'm not going to say that it doesn't come, these different personalities, without some anxiety and conflict, but over time, despite the disagreements, these individuals have come to appreciate each other, and I guess I'm just happy living with these different perspectives within me. And maybe maybe it's fair, if you read the book, to see that maybe there's not one point of view that's driving everything. Maybe you actually can see more than one approach going on here, and I'm fine with that, because again, I can't put all the pieces together. I don't have big pictures. All I can do is sort of muddle through and say, well, that's probable, or that's plausible, or I don't think that happened. I don't know. For whatever reason, I'm happy doing that.
Yeah, that's awesome. I mean, I asked that question to properly commence our discussion, but also out of like personal curiosity. I would say you have no idea how much I relate to that idea of like different personalities and selves, from pious to hyper skeptic within you. But it seems like you kind of
Mm-hmm.
do understand because you've essentially described my experience. So I just really appreciate that and your modest approach. Um, this next question is about the significance of the resurrection, and it kind of has two parts. So, one, if Jesus' resurrection was a real occurrence, why does that matter or not matter all that much? And second, if we don't just say Jesus rose from the dead, but we actually attribute agency to it, that is, if we say God, Yahweh, raised Jesus from the dead, then how is that potentially a bigger question?
Okay, uh, let me try and tackle these things, but uh, let me reiterate that I hope I'm doing all this modestly and humbly. I don't want to be pontifical about these things, but it seems to me, if you're asking for the significance, that the question itself needs to be reframed so that there's a plural. In other words, the resurrection of Jesus does not historically or philosophically or theologically have one significance, one point of significance. It means multiple things. So, for example, I can think off the top of my head of three things it means. So, again, to go back to the book of Acts, one of the things it is a vindication of Jesus. The crucifixion seems to falsify for the disciples, or certainly the wider public seems to falsify his mission and his self-conception and what he was all about. It seemed to confirm that God was not on his side. The resurrection then says, no, the opponents were wrong. The people who crucified him were wrong. God was on his side. And so what he was all about, we have to take seriously. In some sense, it has God's stamp of approval. Now, that's one thing that it means. That's one way in which it is significant. But if you look at Christian history, a lot of people have looked at the resurrection of Jesus and they've said, well, one of the things it does is it encourages us to believe that there is life beyond death. There's the possibility of something more than just this life. And that's what happens with Jesus. His story isn't concluded in burial. That's not the end of the story. And Christians have looked at the New Testament and said, well, there's something more for us too. It's not just that we all die and go away, and that's and that's the end of it. Um, another um, really important thing in Christian history is that this is not just about, let's say, Jesus and me. Jesus rose from the dead, so there might be life after death from me. There's the notion that somehow the resurrection defeats death, or shows that it has been defeated in some way. And the way that this gets expressed in early Christianity, second century, third century, and fourth century, and then on down in the creeds, is that Jesus, before he rose from the dead, was in Hades, or was in the land of the dead. This comes across, as you may know, in some versions of the Apostles' Creed, as he descended into hell. And most Protestants don't do anything with that. And a lot of Protestant churches just take that line out. But it's really important historically, because what it is saying is that Jesus, and this is the picture or the myth, however you want to interpret it, is that Jesus descended to Hades and rescued the dead or the righteous dead. Now, the early Christians don't agree on exactly who is getting rescued. Maybe everybody, maybe some people, maybe the saints of the Old Testament, maybe those who respond to Jesus in Hades. Anyway, the notion is that it's not just Jesus's resurrection, it is a corporate event, and his victory over death is everybody else's victory over death. And you can see this in the old icons of the resurrection, where Jesus isn't rising from the dead by himself. His hands are actually down, and he's pulling up Adam and Eve from Hades. And then there are other saints, such as David and Moses, standing around because they've already been resurrected. So the point here is that you don't just have an event that has a single meaning. The resurrection is like maybe it's like a great novel. If you read any great novel, the Brothers Karamazov or Lord of the Rings, War and Peace, there's no one meaning. You can't boil down the moral of the story. It means in one sentence such and such. Important events and stories have potentially multiple and manifest meanings, and that's true with the resurrection of Jesus. Now, you asked me something about Yahweh, and so here I guess I would say two things. Maybe one is not quite to the point, but if you're thinking of theological categories, Jesus is a Jew, and his God is the God of Israel. So if you think something truly important is happening with the resurrection, something metaphysical, then you're going to have to pay attention to Jesus's God, and that's the God of Israel. And for me, what that means, among other things, is it means learning the Hebrew Bible, learning these scriptures that were scripture for Jesus. And for me, it also means paying attention to the history of the Jewish people, and not just the history up to Jesus, but the entirety of its history. So maybe that's directly an answer to your question. But I'd also say, because you're asking about the character of God, the way I think of this is that if God raises Jesus from the dead, and if that's some sort of stamp of approval, then the thought you have is that maybe somehow the character of Jesus is related to the character of God, or the character of God is mirrored in Jesus, or the character you see in Jesus somehow reflects the divine character. And that for me is a profound thought. And I guess I would like it to be true. I like this Jesus in many ways, although he's not just comforting and encouraging. He's also very, very demanding and threatening, and can be judgmental. But anyway, for me, theologically, you're going to have to ask questions about the relationship between the character of Jesus and the character of God, and you're going to have to draw some sort of parallels between those two things. So I think that's my answer to your question.
Yeah, I think that's very helpful. And then just the last preliminary question for me, just to equip the audience who might not be familiar with your book or any of your scholarship, what are the essential conclusions of your 2021 book?
Well, so from one point of view, the conclusions are very conservative. In other words, they put me on the more conservative side of the divide within the academy. So I think it more likely than not, on historical grounds, that Jesus was buried by somebody named Joseph of Arimathea, although his motives still remain unclear to me. And I think it likely, historically, that the tomb was discovered to be empty by some women very soon after the body was deposited there. And I think that the conclusion Jesus had risen from the dead, or God raised Jesus from the dead, goes back to week one of church history. I think that the stories in Matthew and John have an historical memory, and that Mary Magdalene was probably the first to have an appearance, and that Peter has one shortly thereafter. And then there are several other appearances. So those are all very, very conservative conclusions, but I don't end up with a sort of apologetical agenda. And I suppose we'll get into this in a minute, but I'm not on board with what's known as the minimal facts approach. That is, you can line up several facts or highly likely conclusions, and then from them you can infer that Jesus rose from the dead. I think things are more difficult than that. So what that means is that people on the conservative side of the fence, uh, they like my historical conclusions, but they think I'm too skeptical about what follows from those conclusions. Uh, I think that's a fair summary, although the book does cover a lot of territory. It looks at Marian visions and Tibetan stories about disappearing bodies, and it looks at comparative visions. I guess let me just add one more thing now that I think about it. One of the things I conclude in the book, after two very long chapters, is that the appearances were visionary or visionary-like experiences. And I come to this conclusion because if you study firsthand accounts of visions from various times and places, there are certain motifs that recur again and again, and they also appear in these stories in the Gospels. So it's very common in a vision for a figure just to appear, just to show up out of nowhere, like in John 20, where Jesus seems to just pop into the room. It's also very common for these figures just to disappear, to exit in some extraordinary way, sort of blink out of existence. The Jesus of the Gospels, after he appears, doesn't just walk off into the sunset and you could follow him if you wanted to. That's clearly not what's going on. And there are other features such as the relative brevity of these experiences. Jesus doesn't go on and give a discourse like the Sermon on the Mount. These are very short lived experiences. They also cause doubt. That's a consistent motif in the tradition, and that's also true in lots of, let's say, modern visions where people ostensibly see the dead. Visionary experiences can lead to conversions or changes of mind. So one of the things I did here is look at all the parallels, not in order to debunk the experiences, but in order to find the closest parallels I could. And then I hedged my bet. I didn't say, well, they must have been visionary, but I've said that they were visionary or visionary-like experiences. Again, trying to be cautious there. But even the early Christians themselves know this at some level, because they use a word that comes into English, a Greek word that means appear. He appeared to them. And that is a word that's used frequently in the Old Testament in connection with visionary experiences or theophanies, dramatic visionary experiences. So there's some sense that something similar is going on. So I don't think these events are just mundane events like you and me just walking down the street. Even when Jesus is there in the Gospel of Luke at the end, in chapter 22, he's walking with two people and they don't recognize him. It's exceedingly odd. They don't recognize him until he just disappears, just dissipates, walks into the next dimension or whatever is going on there. Which is also something that sometimes happens in visionary experiences. So that's another thing that I'm doing, and I don't fit here. I'm again sort of between I'm in the wilderness between the skeptic and the apologist, because the apologist doesn't want any sort of visionary stuff going on here with the gospel accounts anyway. But unlike the skeptic, I don't think all visionary experiences are hallucinations. I don't think that they are all purely subjective. Some of them, obviously, and of course, are. But I think sometimes visionary experiences are not purely endogenous, and they can be projections in response to input from outside the self. So that's a hard place to be because nobody likes it. You're in the middle, but that's where I end.
Well, I for one do like it. I mean, seeing your conclusions, like they do tend to be on the more conservative side, and so coming into this with, looking back, I know I had a clear apologetic bias. I wanted the resurrection to be true and whatnot, and so I see, oh, even Dr. Dale Allison says he was buried and probably there was an empty tomb. But then when I see like your cautiousness and the parallels, and I know you're not trying to disprove the resurrection with parallels.
No,
Um,
no, not at all.
right, right. So when I see that, and I see, and we'll talk about the skeptical scenario just now, how these conclusions don't necessitate resurrection, or at least there needs to be a lot more done apart from just minimal facts. Hey, we can show this, this, and that, and therefore Jesus rose from the dead. There has to be more work done in order to do that.
Yeah, well, you're exactly right. So uh, I don't know which self this is, but this self, or maybe more than one self, just thinks it's a lot harder than the skeptics have thought or the apologists have thought. And that's one of the points of the book, uh, to complexify things. And by the way, I should also say that this book is not a book of hard and fast conclusions. As I say somewhere, it's a sort of report from a journey, and I'm still on my way. And I'm really simply saying, look, here are some observations, here are some parallels, here are some thoughts I have, and I'm hoping other people will read this and respond to it, and that it will inform the ongoing conversation. I have no illusions that it's the end or conclusion of anything. My hope is simply that I have some thoughts and observations that might be new, or at least people haven't paid enough attention to. Uh, so it's a contribution to an ongoing discussion, not a here's where what everybody should think. And you know, I've proven what everyone should think or demonstrated it in some way.
Right. All right. So the main purpose of this video is to compare the resurrection with your skeptical scenario. So first of all, what is your skeptical scenario, and why could you describe it as the naturalist's best bet?
Okay, so there are lots of people who don't want Jesus to rise from the dead, or who do not think he rose from the dead. And they have written books and articles explaining how it was that the disciples concluded God had raised Jesus from the dead, when God had not really done this. So there are multiple skeptical scenarios. You're probably familiar with Mike Licona's big book on the resurrection. It's a very big book. It was published, I don't know, over 10 years ago now. And one of the things he does in that book is he looks at various skeptical scenarios, and he says none of these are really good or convincing. And I agree with his analysis. I think most of the skeptical options are deficient in obvious ways. And if I were a skeptic, I would not be comforted by any of them. So, what I set out to do was to say, okay, if I were a skeptic, which I'm not, but if I were a skeptic, what what's the best explanation I could come up with, right? And I thought this would be fair. And you want to play devil's advocate, you want to play devil's advocate and be honest. So I thought about this, and in the book, I conclude that people did believe in an empty tomb from an early period, and they did have experiences that they understood as encounters with the postmortem Jesus. So how would I explain this if I'm not going to appeal to the Christian God or some other supernatural agent? And I came up with this. I said, okay, it's going to be uh, three things. The first thing that it's going to be is tomb robbery. That is, we're going to accept the gospel testimony that the tomb was empty on Sunday morning. And the explanation for that, if I were a skeptic, would be, well, tomb robbery seems to have been fairly common in antiquity. There is evidence for it around Jesus's time and place. And there are some magical texts which seem to indicate that a victim of violence would have particularly worthwhile parts for magical recipes and so on. So I thought, okay, I don't need God for an empty tomb. I'll just get some tomb robbers. And that would explain why the stone was rolled away, because tomb robbers aren't going they're just going to take a body and run, get out of there as fast as possible. Then the second ingredient would be, now this is standard in the skeptical scenarios. I would just say, well, Mary Magdalene must have hallucinated Jesus. She thought she saw Jesus, but she didn't. We do know that human beings can hallucinate things that are not there. And then the same thing happened to Peter. And then after that, it's just sort of a thing that catches on, like a Bigfoot sighting. You know, one person sees Bigfoot, and all of a sudden you have several Bigfoot reports. Very strange phenomenon. Or one person sees a UFO, and then over the next month, a lot of people in that region also see a UFO. So you'd be skeptical about the appearances. And then the third ingredient, if I were a skeptic, would be to appeal to Luke 19, because Luke 19 says that when the disciples were going up to Jerusalem, and this is the week before the crucifixion, and so just a few days before they declared God raised Jesus from the dead, they thought the kingdom of God was to appear immediately. Now, I think by kingdom of God there, they must mean the whole shebang, right? They must mean resurrection of the dead and all the things, the judgment that are going to happen at the end. So again, if I were a skeptic, I would say, okay, we have that belief, it's in place. They think the end is near. Luke says they thought it. Okay. So they thought the end was near. And in Judaism, if the end is near, then the resurrection is near, because that's what happens at the end. So if you have an empty tomb and then two or more people saying that they've seen Jesus, and you have this belief in place, it allows you to interpret this to say that the resurrection of the dead has begun. The end has begun to unfold, and so on. So that's the skeptical scenario I came up with, and I said, if I were a skeptic, that's what I would think. If tomorrow I were to become an atheist, that is what I would think. So does that give you enough information to work with?
Yeah, it does, definitely. And I think some people have sort of critiqued your work by saying, or critiqued kind of skeptical scenarios in general by saying, even if the apostles saw an empty tomb and had a sort of, subjective vision, maybe a hallucination that wasn't robustly physical in nature, that wouldn't have convinced them of resurrection. They could have just concluded that Jesus was translated, or that he ascended from the tomb.
Uh-huh.
But that third element of your skeptical scenario, which is sort of pre-Easter eschatological expectations,
Yeah. Uh-huh.
that the end, including resurrection, not translation or exaltation necessarily, but especially resurrection, is imminent. That's how you would explain why they concluded resurrection as opposed to something else. Is that correct?
Yeah. Yes, you caught on, and lots of people don't see that, and I don't know why. I'm not going to name names here, but it just seems obvious to me. Now, there's one other thing that people miss, and I tried to call attention to it 15 years ago in another book, and then I tried to emphasize it twice. So when we think about visions, and then we think about subjective visions, we think we know what we're talking about. Now, first of all, I've done a lot of work on visions, and I don't know what visions are. I don't think they're a single thing. I think they're really complex. I think visual perception is really, really complex. I'm not even sure I know what's going on right now looking at this screen. Um, but the thing is, if you read the literature about visions, you will discover that there are visions that do not in any way seem unrealistic. There are people who, if it's hallucination, are hallucinating flesh and blood bodies. They can touch them, they feel them, their husband hugs them, things like this. I've even found a couple of accounts uh, where people said, "Yeah, I saw my husband and he hugged me, and it was just like the disciples in Jesus, who could actually, you know, touch his side or touch his feet." So you have to remember this too. Now, I don't have statistics. I don't know how common this is, but I do know it's not that rare. And again, let's just hypothesize, because I'm playing skeptic right now. Let's just say Mary or Peter didn't just see something like an ethereal, see through Jesus, but actually saw a guy that looked completely real and that he or she might even have, touched and thought they were, thought that the body was there. Then, well, there you go, too. So, yeah, those two things mean that the usual easy out, which is, well, they just would have said, he was living on after death or he had ascended, those don't work in my judgment. So, maybe I should be unhappy about this because I'm not a skeptic and I want to believe Jesus rose from the dead. But again, if I were a skeptic, I could live with this. I wouldn't be walking around saying, "Oh, oh, 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 oh." I would say, "Okay, I think I got it." All right.
Yeah. So, um, let's just move on to one of my major questions, which is about, well, here it is. So, you, so I had an idea to like put all these scholars that have worked on the priors of miracles on the side, um, because that's what my
Uh-huh.
question is about. So, how do you, Dr. Allison, when you take into account all your relevant background knowledge, including what you know about tomb raiding in antiquity, candidate cases of collective visions or hallucinations or apparition literature, candidate cases of genuine miracles, natural theology, the person of Jesus. You talked about the Jewish context that precedes and the Christian context that follows his death, and including what you know about the work of these scholars here. Um, do you think, which hypothesis do you think has a higher prior probability? The resurrection or your skeptical scenario?
Okay, so you're nobody's going to be pleased with my response to that question. So my answer is that the way you formulated this in terms of prior probability, you are implying that we can make a quantitative judgment. All right, we can make a quantitative judgment. To my mind, if you're talking about probability, you're talking about something that's greater than 50-50. And in fact, if I look at these pictures of these five gentlemen over here, I know that two of them have actually tried to put things into numbers, right? I don't myself know how to quantify the things that they quantify. There is nothing wrong with Bayes' theorem. It works in all sorts of situations. It's turned out to be a very fruitful equation. Um, but the problem is, what numbers do you plug in, right, to get your answer at the end? And I don't know how to do that. I simply don't know how to think in terms of quantity. Now, if you're asking about my own background beliefs, maybe you're asking about something like natural theology. So I find it very hard not to think about some things teleologically, which is consistent with a designer of some sort. Although nature seems too messy to me to be just the product of a wonderful designer. I think there must be other things going on. But anyway, I also am attracted to certain cosmological arguments because the distinction between contingent and non-contingent being makes philosophical sense for me, helps me to understand things. I also personally think that we have some reason to think that there is a life beyond this one, even apart from Christianity, religion, revelations, and so on. I really do. I do think that. I also think, on the basis of certain mystical and religious experiences, that there are some decent reasons for thinking that uh, or positing a sacred other. Okay, but that's the extent of my natural theology, and it doesn't give me Christianity, all right? It just gives me these sort of presumptions, and I don't know how the heck to turn them into numbers. I don't know how to turn what I just said to you into numbers. It actually doesn't make sense to me. But I can't get to Christianity from what I just told you, because I think there are multiple worldviews which are consistent with what I just told you, right? Assuming that I'm right. And beyond that, Christians have never thought, obviously, that you can get Christianity without special revelation. They've distinguished between natural revelation and special revelation, and they need something more because the sorts of things I just gave you leave open all sorts of religious and philosophical possibilities. So my problem here is that I don't know how to think in terms of quantity. Maybe if I were smarter or if I knew more, um, it would be different. All I can say is that looking at the two gentlemen here who have turned things into numbers, I've looked at their material and they simply don't convince me. So they don't convince me. So the truth at the end of the day is that for me, this isn't an equation, and it's not even probability. It becomes something that's personal, and I'm not a fightist. I just shared with you, I think I have reasons for believing certain things or inclining to certain things. The way I look at this is that I have a sort of worldview, and how it wasn't constructed logically. It was constructed piece by piece over time. Part of it was handed to me by my parents. Part of it was handed to me early on through religious education. That it was modified through books and so on and so on. So I've developed over the course of my life some kind of worldview. And the resurrection of Jesus functions well within that worldview. It doesn't answer all my questions, and my worldview doesn't answer all my questions. I still have lots of questions and problems and issues. But the resurrection functions sensibly within this web of other beliefs and convictions that I have, and therefore I believe it, or I can believe it. But I don't know how to take this web of convictions, which, by the way, is idiosyncratic. I mean, it's nobody else's. It's my own thing. I share parts of it with other people, but nobody has exactly my outlook or my worldview. So I don't know how to turn that into to an argument. Uh, it just fits. So as I said, you're going to be disappointed. Everybody else is disappointed. People are always disappointed in me because I don't know how to come up with the numerical answers or the sure and certain conclusions. It's kind of foggy. Again, I'm not a fightist. I don't say, well, I believe because I want to believe or because God gave me faith. That's not it. But I will add here, tack on to all that I just said, that historically it is the case that 99.9999, I don't know how many nines, percent of Christians historically have not believed in the resurrection of Jesus because of an argument, right? We just know that, right? So you have to look at those people and you have to say, well, none of them have good reasons for believing what they did, right? Or you have to say, maybe argument isn't the only way to get to certain religious conclusions, or at least the sorts of arguments that are typically um, on display in modern apologetics. If I could generalize, which I probably shouldn't. So I take that back. Anyway, arguments that you often often see. Okay.
Yeah, I mean, I also don't love to kind of do history or even philosophy with numbers. I don't like saying, oh, there's a 63% probability that Platonism is false or anything like that. I can't. I mean, I personally don't feel equipped to like argue against them or critique their work. I just am kind of with you where I don't love doing that, but I guess my part of my methodology isn't a strict numerical Bayesian approach, but I follow something like an intuitive Bayesianism, where and I know appealing to intuitions is sort of tricky, but saying
Uh-huh.
I think I can at least say that your skeptical scenario and even the traditional, you know, Christian view have higher prior probabilities than the hypothesis that Babylonian gods raised Jesus from the
Uh-huh.
dead. Because that, I mean, that doesn't really make sense with our background knowledge. It also, seems. I feel like using our intuitions and using some things we know about natural theology, or even, I mean, some of these have argued that. Well, maybe I should backtrack. You say that natural theology doesn't get you to specifically Christian doctrines, and I agree. Um, but what people like William Paley have argued is that if there is a God, and if there's good reason to think that there is a God, just a general God, who desires to reveal himself to mankind in clear ways, whatever that may be, I think most theists could agree on that, unless you're a deist. Um, then that whatever that probability is, even if there's not a number, that's the probability that there would be a miracle, some kind of miracle. And so that basically makes it that's basically contra Hume, who says the prior of a miracle is insurmountably low. So
Oh,
natural
well,
theology, yeah.
well, we certainly agree on that. I don't think Hume is right at all. Actually, I'm sorry, let me qualify that. I don't buy Hume's conclusion. I actually, though, think that he's largely right by appealing to experience. I just think his notion of what human beings have experienced is very, very limited. So to go back to the Fordian, I live in a very strange universe. I've seen odd things. Things have happened to me that don't fit what I was taught in my scientific textbooks, or what a lot of my scientific friends believe. So I actually think the world is a really strange and wondrous place, and that it doesn't fit between the lines that we like to draw, or fit what Hume says it should fit. But Hume, he can talk about laws. I don't know anything about these laws. I don't know who wrote them. I don't know how we decipher them. Uh, so I guess part of this also, is that my the book I wrote after the book I wrote after the book on the resurrection is called Encountering Mystery, and it's a book on religious experience, and it gives you in part the reasons why I simply think Hume is completely wrong. He just has a very narrow worldview. I think the world is very strange, but I also think it's complicated because there are theistic Hindus, right? And there are theistic Hindus who don't have a problem saying that Jesus rose from the dead. There are Jews who think God works miracles, but don't think that God raised Jesus in particular from the dead. That is, within the theistic camp, right? You still have a great deal of disagreement about this or that. Uh, and then you have Islam and Sufis, and you can go on and on. So again, maybe at the end of the day, if I continue to think about this, I'll end up someplace that I am not now. But once more, I think it's really complicated. One of the things I uh, observe in the book is that I know of Tibetan Buddhists who think that Jesus rose from the dead. They just think of it with different categories. They think Jesus was a sage and a very spiritual person, and that he obtained what's called rainbow body. And so there are stories. I have a whole chapter on this, whatever you make of it. There's a Tibetan tradition that certain masters, certain people who have achieved a certain religious state, uh, they dissipate, they disappear very soon, a few days after they die. And then there are stories of them coming back and speaking to their disciples and so on. Now, the point here isn't to say I believe those stories. I don't know what to make of them. It's just to say that the interpretive possibilities are multiple here. And again, you've just got to be really, really careful, I think, and more careful than a lot of people are or have been. It's harder for me to get to these conclusions through A implies B implies C implies D implies E, and we add it all up together, and then we get the Christian doctrine.
Yeah, and I appreciate you pointing out that, I mean, everyone's background knowledge will be different. Like, there's tons of interpretive possibilities from theists or Forteans to naturalists, even within the theistic camp. Your worldview shapes your priors, and your prior shapes your conclusions. So I was wondering, for you personally, given your own idiosyncratic worldview, and you don't have to assign numbers to it. Like, do you think which hypothesis do you think has a higher prior, or would you say it's kind of inscrutable?
It's inscrutable because even if you say, even if you want to take into account background knowledge or your priors, your probabilities, nobody agrees on. I don't think anyone agrees on exactly what those are. Certainly, I have my own. So what I can say again is that this fits. And if you want to say, okay, I think it's more probable than not. Yeah, I think it's more probable than not. But again, I don't know how to turn that into an argument. And I may be deficient here. I may not be seeing the light. Uh, and maybe it's not a question of abstractly saying it couldn't be done. It's just I've not been convinced by anybody who's tried to do it yet.
That's fair. Yeah, I think that's fair. You said you have an hour. I don't know if I should go to the last little section of my video or.
You've got 10 minutes. Sure, go ahead.
All right. So let's see. I wanted to ask you probably just quickly about simplicity. This is like my other major question. In response to combination hypotheses such as your scenario, which involves several different components, apologists often say, well, the resurrection is simpler and thus more probable. And that could be articulated in a number of ways, but essentially it's if the resurrection and your skeptical scenario are comparable in terms of explanatory power and scope, parsimony could potentially be the symmetry breaker, or in layman's terms, simplicity could be the tiebreaker. So, I mean, what do you think of that? Do you think that the resurrection is actually simpler, and do you think it matters all that much?
So first of all, I'm not sure how to think about simples. So it's not obvious to me, this is the first thing to say, it's not obvious to me that the resurrection is a sort of simple hypothesis because it involves multiple actors. It involves God the Father, who's separate than Jesus, although he's an actor in this. It's got an angel in here. And it's also got people who are witnesses and are participating in the action. And you've got a tomb and you've got visions. I mean, you have to you posit multiple experiences, multiple events, And it's not clear that by saying God did it all, that you're getting rid of the fact that you have multiple agents. So first of all, I'm just not sure about that. Okay, that's the first thing. But secondly, this is just not how we think historically. That is, anything important in history has multiple causes. Things that are small have multiple causes. So why did I marry my wife? Is there a reason, one reason, the right reason? That doesn't make any sense. What was the cause of World War One? There's no single cause of World War One, and I don't know what sense it would make for an historian to say, well, I've got the single cause of World War One, and you're giving us three causes for World War One, so mine must be better because I have one. That doesn't make any sense to me. So maybe I'm missing something here.
Well,
But what I am
if it's
sure
all right.
about,
Oh yeah, sorry.
yeah.
If it's all right for me to interject, um, if you, of course, it's right to, it's actually justifiable and even warranted to say that a more complicated theory is, to be favored over a simpler theory if that theory, if the more complicated theory can explain more data and explain that data better. But if we're granting that the two hypotheses have similar explanatory power and scope, that they can explain Paul's conversion and the empty tomb and early resurrection belief, if we grant that they're similar in those senses, do you think that simplicity could be the tiebreaker in a sense?
So I I doubt it. So what I would do is I would just look at other examples. So for example, if you talk to Muslims, they use a simplicity argument, and they'll say things like, well, you know what? Islam spread like wildfire. How do we explain that? How do we explain the Quran, given that Muhammad didn't have the education to produce this book? How do we explain the auditions of Muhammad? How do we explain the visions of Muhammad, and so on? So you have multiple things going on in early Islam, and you could just say God. But people who aren't Muslims, they don't have any trouble saying, well, we explain Muhammad this way, and then here's how we explain the book, text critically, and so on and so on, and here's how we explain sociologically the spread of Islam. Or it's similar with Mormonism. If you're an apologist and you're trying to explain Mormonism, you've got several things to explain. First of all, where did this book come from? Where did it come from? Joseph Smith did not write it. He didn't write it. I know that. Everybody knows that. He didn't write it. So where did it come from? But then how do you explain the stories that Joseph Smith told? Those are two things you have to explain. But then you have the witnesses at the beginning of the Book of Mormon who saw the golden tablets, right? So if you are an anti-Mormon, all right, you'll say, well, here's an explanation for the Book of Mormon, and here's what I think about Joseph Smith, and here's what explains these people who are, at the front of the Book of Mormon. There's two lists of witnesses, who saw these things. So you've got multiple things, but the believer will just say, the Mormon will just say, heck, it's all God. One simple explanation. So I don't think that the people who make this argument use it in other areas. And as an historian, I'm not sure I've ever used it. So it makes sort of sense in the abstract, but if you look at the messiness of history, I'm not sure that we should be on board with that.
Yeah, that's helpful. I mean, I'll admit it seems kind of awfully easy to come up with a simpler supernatural explanation because you only need to posit one mechanism, the power of God, or whichever God you want, in a sense.
Yeah.
I mean, yeah, one of my friends suggested that simplicity can be a good, proper, deciding theoretical virtue if your supernatural explanation is already on the table, in a sense, if it has a moderately high prior, but then you go into what we talked about earlier, where you say it's almost inscrutable.
Yeah, but so look again, or think about this. So if you look at Christian history, look at the number of things Christians attributed to the devil, or at least some people. So epilepsy is one, right? Bad luck is another. Lightning is another. Illness is another. You can actually come up with dozens and dozens of things, right? And it was a nice, simple hypothesis. The devil does all these things. But historically, we've learned that a number of these things can be explained in other terms. And there's no single explanation for these things that used to be under the single umbrella. And I don't think that bothers anybody. We say what used to have a single explanation now has multiple explanations, and that's just the complexity of the world. So I don't see why a skeptic couldn't respond with that.
I think that's fair. I'll definitely have to think about that and discuss it more with my own circle off camera.
Okay.
All right. So maybe we can conclude this discussion. And you don't have to. I know we like to go on and elaborate, and I love that. But in these last few minutes, I have a few questions for you that I'll end every interview with. So first, what's a significant thing you've changed your mind on, either from research or from writing or studying or even just experience and conversations?
Okay, so one thing pops into my head, and I'm sort of proud of it. So I went to graduate school. I started in the 70s. That's the 1970s. And got my PhD in the 80s. And my teachers and the books I read at that point of time told me that if I wanted to do research on Jesus, I should learn about the so-called criteria of authenticity and how to apply them, right? So these are criteria, and you take units, individual sayings, parables, stories in the gospel tradition, and you run them through or analyze them in terms of these criteria. And
you're talking about like
that
double. You're talking about double
yeah, like
dissimilarity
multiple attestation and dissimilarity and embarrassment and so on. So if you read my first book, and if you read my 3-volume commentary on Matthew, where I look at historical questions as well as exegetical questions, I am constantly appealing to those criteria. But after I finished the commentary on Matthew in the mid-90s, I began to have questions about these criteria. And then I wrote a book on Jesus in which I offered criticisms of them. I didn't have an alternative. But since then, I have continued to criticize them and no longer use them for much of anything. So this was the central way I did things, and it was what I was taught, and I was 100% on board. But then through my own reading and experience and reflection, I decided to marginalize them and not to emphasize them and to try to approach the material through other ways. So that's a way in which I think experience taught me to change. If you look at, maybe you're familiar with John Mayer's 5-volume book called A Marginal Jew. It's 5 volumes on Jesus. And if you look at those 5 volumes, which are massive and very impressive and very important, he uses the criteria of authenticity all the way through. That's what the project is built upon. And I personally have come to the view that what I did earlier was flawed and that there are better ways of approaching things. So that's one example. And since I'm, among other things, an historian of Jesus, that was a really significant change of mind.
Yeah, I was introduced to these kind of apologetics discussions, and I've since actually reading your book, I've kind of not wanted to call it like apologetics anymore, but truth seeking or pursuing deeper understanding or things like that, because it's not just about defending Christianity anymore.
Uh-huh.
And so I love the criteria of authenticity. I'm like, wow, I have tests I can do on that passage to see whether it's true or not. But since then, I've tried to, I've strayed away from that, and I'm trying to adopt a more holistic approach where I look at the context and authorship and purpose and how it interacts with the rest of the narrative and other historical work. So yeah, I actually really appreciate that. My second question is just, what are some more personal factors that influence your worldview, factors that don't constitute propositional evidence like an argument or something.
Oh, well, so if you're talking about the book on resurrection, I guess we could do that. A couple of things come to mind. One is I just hate death. I hate death. I don't like it, and I don't want to die. And death has taken my parents from me, and my aunts and uncles, and lots of my very dear friends, and my beloved pets. And I personally don't know how to make theological sense of the world if death is the end of everything. So that influences the way I think about things, and certainly influences how I approach, I suppose, some of the questions surrounding the resurrection of Jesus, right? So death is my enemy. I dislike it. And I actually want it to be an illusion. I want us all to die and wake up and realize that there's more than just this world. The other thing that certainly influences that book, but's influenced everything, is that I was taught explicitly and implicitly in college how to be a reductionistic materialist. I was taught that we are material and that everything is material, and we can explain everything in terms of science, chemistry, biology, and so on. At least potentially, we can explain everything. And I am not in that camp. I think it is 100% wrong. I think it's been empirically falsified, and it opens up all sorts of possibilities and worlds for me. When I was in college, or maybe I put it this way, for many of my teachers, theology wasn't even a possibility, or life after death wasn't even a possibility. Taking religion seriously wasn't a possibility. It was just something you could analyze sociologically or psychologically or historically, but it wasn't anything you could take seriously because there was no invisible world, no transcendent world, no gods, no God, no spirits, and so on. My latest book, after the resurrection, is a sort of explanation for an alternative worldview, and in part, I suppose, a defense of that. So that influences certainly everything I do. So if you look at the work of Bart Ehrman, he has a very different worldview. He's very smart, very intelligent, very learned, and he starts from different places than I start, and that affects how his arguments unfold, just as it affects how my arguments unfold.
All right, that's awesome. And just finally, any final thoughts, resources, advice to me or other truth seekers?
Oh gosh, I don't like to give advice. Just stay humble. Knowledge is wonderful. I spent a lifetime pursuing knowledge and trying to learn. But at the end of the day, whatever you come up with, it's a drop in the bucket, against the scheme of things, against the mind of God, against the size of the universe. So always remember Socrates, and always remember that pride is a bad thing, and that humility is a virtue. So that would be my final thought.
I really appreciate that, honestly. Thank you so much, Dr. Allison, for joining me. I suppose I should do the obligatory, YouTube ending. Make sure you like and subscribe if you watch this video. Turn on the notification bell, comment, all that. Anyways, thank you, Dr. Allison, once again. I'll see you all next time.